Declan found the idea on a Tuesday night, somewhere between his third beer and the moment Lena slid the credit card statement across the kitchen table, without saying a word. The number at the bottom wasn't catastrophic on its own, but stacked on top of the car payment they'd pushed the next month, and the water heater that had been making a sound like a dying animal since September, it felt catastrophic enough. He remembered staring at it for a long time, not because he was reading it. He'd already read it twice, but because looking at the paper meant he didn't have to look at Lena, and looking at Lena meant seeing the particular kind of tired that had nothing to do with sleep. She wasn't angry. That was almost worse. She was just tired in the way people get tired when they've been worried for too long, and the worry has stopped feeling urgent and started feeling like weather, like something permanent you just learn to live inside of. The spare room had been an office for about 6 months after they moved in, then a storage room for another year, and then nothing, just a door then a hall that neither of them opened much because there was no reason to. It wasn't a bad room. That was the thing Declan kept coming back to as he pulled up the rental platform on his laptop and started filling out the listing. It wasn't dark or strange or difficult to photograph. It had a window that faced a backyard, a decent-sized closet, and enough space for a queen bed and a small dresser without feeling cramped. Lena had even put a little frame print on the wall at some point, something with muted colors and soft shapes, the kind of art that existed purely to make a room feel inhabited without demanding any attention. It was fine. It was more than fine. It was exactly the kind of room that photographs well and books fast, and that was what they needed. Declan posted the listing on a Wednesday and had their first inquiry by Friday morning. He showed Lena the notification over breakfast, and she smiled the real kind, and he felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized had been wound tight. They spent that weekend getting the room ready properly, not just clean but welcoming. New pillows from the discount home store 2 towns over, a small lamp with a warm bulb on the nightstand, a little basket near the door with spare toiletries, and a folded spare blanket that Lena picked out because it was soft and a good color, a deep green that made the room feel grounded. Declan hung a mirror on the back of the closet door, and Lena said it made the room look bigger, and he agreed, and they both stood in the doorway looking in at what they'd made, and it looked genuinely nice. It looked like a room someone would want to stay in. The first guest was a woman named Ivy, mid-30s based on her profile photo, with a handful of good reviews from previous hosts and a short bio that said she traveled for work and preferred quiet neighborhoods. She booked 4 nights starting on a Thursday, which was a longer stay than Declan had expected for a first booking, and he'd messaged her the check-in instructions with the kind of careful friendliness he imagined good hosts used, explaining the door code and the Wi-Fi password, and letting her know there was coffee in the kitchen she was welcome to use. Ivy arrived on Thursday evening, while Declan and Lena were finishing dinner. She was polite at the door, a little reserved but not unfriendly. The kind of person who smiles and means it, but doesn't feel the need to fill silence with small talk, which suited Declan fine. He showed her the room, and she stood in the doorway for just a moment before stepping inside, and he noticed the pause but didn't think anything of it. People always pause in doorways. He said goodnight, and closed the door at the end of the hall, and went back to Lena and told her it seemed fine. And Lena said good, and they watched television until 11 and went to bed. Declan woke at 7 the next morning to find the house quiet in a way that felt slightly different from usual. He couldn't have explained what was different about it. It was the same silence a house always had in the morning, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of someone's dog a few streets over. The particular stillness that sits in a house before anyone has started moving around in it. But something about it made him stop at the top of the stairs and listen for a moment before going down. The door to the guest room was closed. He made coffee. He checked his phone. The notification appeared at 7:43, a 1-star review from Ivy, already posted, time-stamped at 3:22 in the morning. He stared at it for a long moment before he read it. The review was 2 words. Don't sleep. He read it again. Then he went and knocked on the guest room door, and no one answered, and when he tried to handle the room was empty, bed barely disturbed, Ivy's bag gone, the little basket of toiletries untouched. He stood in the center of the room and looked around at everything they had carefully arranged, the lamp and the soft blanket and the mirror on the back of the closet door, and nothing was out of place. Nothing was wrong. He called Lena down and showed her the review, and she read it twice and looked up at him, and he said she probably just had a bad night. And Lena said maybe, and neither of them said anything else about it. The second guest was a man named Morris who booked 2 nights the following week. Declan almost hadn't reposted the listing, but the water heater made it sound again on Monday, and that settled it. Morris arrived on a Tuesday evening, quiet and polite the same way Ivy had been, and Declan showed him the room and Morris stepped inside without pausing in the doorway, and Declan thought good and said goodnight and went to bed. Wednesday morning the house had that same quality of silence. Morris was gone. The review appeared at 7:51, 1 star, 2 words, don't sleep, timestamp 3:19 in the morning. Declan sat with his coffee and read it and felt something he didn't want to name. Lena came downstairs and saw his face before she saw the phone. And she said, "What?" And he turned the screen toward her, and she read it and sat down slowly. He said it was a coincidence. She didn't argue. She just looked at the closed door at the end of the hall and said she was going to go freshen up the room. And Declan nodded and went to take a shower. When he came back downstairs 20 minutes later, Lena was standing in the hallway outside the guest room door with her hands at her sides and an expression he didn't have a word for. He asked what was wrong, and she said she had gone into the room and changed the pillowcases and wiped down the nightstand and closed the closet door before she left. She was certain she had closed it. He looked past her at the guest room door, still ajar, and beyond it he could see the closet door standing open, the dark space inside it catching no light at all. He told her the latch was probably loose. He told her old houses did that. He told her it was nothing, and the words sat in the hallway between them like something neither of them wanted to pick up. A third booking came in that same afternoon, a woman named Audra one night, arriving Friday. Lena saw the notification first and brought the phone to Declan, and he looked at it and then looked at her, and she said they needed the money, and he said he knew, and she said so. We accept it, and he said yes, and neither of them mentioned Ivy or Morris or the closet door or the 2 words that had now appeared twice at 3 in the morning like something being repeated on purpose. Audra arrived Friday evening, and she was warm and chatty in a way the first 2 guests hadn't been, asking about good places to eat nearby and complimenting the room. Say it was cozy, saying she loved the green blanket, and Lena smiled and said thank you and showed her where the extra towels were, and Declan felt genuinely better standing there listening to Audra talk about nothing in particular because it felt normal. It felt like what this was supposed to be, just a room and a guest and a little extra money at the end of the month. He said good night, and meant it warmly this time. He and Lena went to bed, and he fell asleep faster than he had in weeks. In the morning, the house was quiet. He knew before he checked. Audra was gone, bag gone, room empty, the green blanket folded at the foot of the bed with precision that felt deliberate, and the closet door was standing wide open in a room where Lena had, once again, closed it the night before while making up the bed. The review came through at 8:12, 1 star, 2 words, and this time when Declan read them, he didn't say anything at all. He just stood in the doorway of the guest room and looked at the open closet and the dark inside it and the careful fold of the green blanket and listened to the house around him, that same thick morning silence, and thought about the fact that 3 different people had walked into this room, slept in this bed, and left before dawn without a word, and all 3 of them had left at 3:17 in the morning, and whatever had made them leave, whatever had made them type those 2 words in the dark on, their way out the door, was still here. Lena came downstairs and found him still standing there, and she looked at the closet and then at him, and he showed her the checkout time on the platform, and then pulled up Morris's and then Ivy's and lined them all up side by side on the screen and held the phone out to her without saying anything because the number said everything. 3:17. 3:17. 3:17. Lena took the phone and looked at it for a long time, and then she handed it back and walked to the kitchen and stood at the counter with her back to him, and he could see her shoulders and the way they were set, not shaking, just still. The way a person goes still when they're working very hard to stay calm. He followed her in and put the phone face down on the counter, and they stood there together in the kitchen, saying nothing for what felt like a long time. Then Lena said she wanted to know what was in that room. Not in the way someone says it when they're asking a practical question about a drafty window or a water stain on the ceiling, but in the way someone says something when they already suspect the answer is something they won't be able to unknow. Declan said there was nothing in the room. He said it the way he'd been saying things like that for the past 2 weeks, with just enough conviction to make it sound like he believed it. Lena looked at him and he looked back, and the word nothing moved between them in the quiet kitchen, like something thin and unconvincing, like a door with a broken latch that no matter how many times you close it just kept drifting open in the night. Audra arrived on a Friday evening the way people arrive when they have no reason to be nervous, rolling a small suitcase up the front walk with her phone in one hand and a reusable coffee cup in the other, pausing at the porch steps to finish a text before she knocked, unhurried and easy in the way of someone who had spent a lot of time staying in other people's homes and had long since stopped feeling strange about it. And Lena opened the door, and Audra smiled the kind of smile that reached her eyes without any effort and said, "Sorry, 1 second." And Lena said, "Take your time." And Declan stood just behind Lena in the hallway and watched Audra finish her message and pocket her phone and look up at them both with an expression of genuine warmth. And something about the normalcy of it made him feel better in a way he hadn't expected, because Audra seemed like someone who would not be rattled by a drafty room or a loose closet latch, someone who had opinions about coffee and kept her. She was very clean and probably left reviews that talked about location and amenities rather than 2-word warnings typed in the dark at 3 a.m, and he led her down the hall and opened the door to the guest room, and Audra stepped inside without hesitating and looked around and said, "Oh, this is lovely. I love this color," meaning the green blanket, which Lena had folded at the foot of the bed again. And Lena said thank you and pointed out the lamp and the Wi-Fi password on the note card on the nightstand, and Audra set her suitcase down near the dresser, and it all felt so ordinary that Declan almost didn't notice the way Audra's eyes moved to the closet door and stayed there for just a half second longer than they needed to. The way a person's gaze sometimes catches on something without the person meaning it to. And then she looked away and asked about parking, and Declan told her the driveway was fine and said goodnight and pulled the door to the guest room almost but not quite, closed behind him the way guests seemed to prefer. And he and Lena went to the kitchen, and Lena made tea, and they sat together at the table and talked about small things, the grocery list, a show they'd been meaning to watch, the noise the water heater was still making, and Declan noticed that neither of them mentioned the room, or Ivy or Morris or the number 317, and he thought that was probably healthy, probably the right approach, to simply move forward and let the evidence of 2 bad guests be exactly what it looked like. 2 bad guests, coincidence, nothing more. And by 10 o'clock, he believed enough to go to bed and fall asleep without lying awake listening to the house the way he had the 2 previous times. Or if he did lie awake listening, he didn't do it for long, and the last thing he remembered before sleep was the sound of the television in the guest room, low and indistinct, which seemed like a good sign, which seemed like the sound of a person simply winding down for the night in a perfectly normal room. Lena woke him sometime in the deep part of the night with her hand on his arm, and his name said once, quietly, the way she said it when she needed him alert but didn't want to startle him. And he came awake fast the way you do when someone uses that particular tone. And he said, "What?" And she said, "Listen." And he listened and heard nothing, which was a thing, because the nothing had a quality to it, a density, like the silence left behind after a loud sound has stopped, like the ringing absence of something he'd missed. And he lay there in the dark with his eyes open, trying to identify what had woken Lena, and could not. And then from the direction of the guest room came something he felt more than heard, a low, resonant pressure with no name, not a knock or a voice or a footstep, just the quality of the air in the house that made his chest feel tight. And then it stopped, and the thick silence came back. And Lena's hand on his arm had not moved at all. He asked her what that was, and she said she didn't know, and he asked how long she'd been awake. And she said a few minutes, and he asked if she wanted to check on Audra, and Lena didn't answer right away. And the pause itself was an answer. And so he got up and went to the hallway and stood outside the guest room door, and the light beneath it was off, and there was no sound at all from inside, and he knocked softly and said, "Audra, everything all right in there?" And nothing answered, and he stood in the dark hallway for a long moment before going back to bed and telling Lena it was fine, and Lena said okay, and neither of them slept again until nearly 5 in the morning. The room was empty at 7. Suitcase gone. Green blanket folded at the foot of the bed with that precise, deliberate neatness that Declan had started to find more unsettling than a mess would have been. The note card with the Wi-Fi password moved from the nightstand to the exact center of the mattress, placed there on purpose, and the closet door standing open in a room where Lena had closed it the afternoon before and was certain of it. He stood in the room and looked at the note card in the open closet and the made bed and felt something tighten behind his sternum. The review came through at 8:04 in the morning, 1 star, 2 words, timestamp 3:17 a.m., and he sat with it at the kitchen table without showing Lena, reading it several more times the way you read something, when you're hoping the meaning will shift if you look long enough. And then he opened the platform's messaging system and found Ivy's contact information and wrote her a short, careful message, neutral and practical, saying he was the host of the property where she'd recently stayed, and he simply wanted to understand if there had been something wrong with the room, something he could address, framing it the way you frame things when you needed information, and didn't want the other person to know how much you needed it. Ivy replied within the hour. 4 words, "Don't rent it out." He called the number on her profile, not expecting her to answer, and she picked up on the second ring. And he introduced himself, and there was a silence that stretched long enough that he thought she would hang up. And then she said, "I can't talk about that place." And her voice had the flat, compressed quality of someone who has made a decision to leave something behind them and has no intention of letting it be pulled back open. And he asked her only one thing, just what happened in that room. And Ivy was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Don't rent it. Just don't rent it." And the line went dead. Declan put the phone on the table and looked at it. Lena came in from a backyard and stopped when she saw his face and came and stood beside him, and he opened the platform and pulled up all 3 checkout times and held the screen out to her without a word because the number said everything he didn't know how to say out loud. 3:17, 3:17, 3:17. Lena looked at the times for a long time, and then she looked at the closed door at the end of the hall, and then back at Declan, and said, "What do we do?" And Declan said he didn't know, and he meant it completely, because he had run out of explanations that felt like enough, and outside the water heater groaned from somewhere in the basement, low and wrong. And the house settled quietly around them, both the way a house does when it has been listening to a conversation, and has nothing it wants to say just yet. He went back to the guest room after Lena had gone upstairs to change, and he stood in the doorway the way he had been standing in doorways a lot lately, and looked at the room they had made together on that hopeful Saturday a few weeks ago, the lamp and the green blanket and the mirror on the closet door, and tried to find the thing that was wrong with it, because there had to be a thing, a practical, explainable thing, a gap in the window frame, or a particular creak in the floorboards that disturbed light sleepers, or some smell from the old pipes that only became noticeable at night, something that could account for 3 people leaving at the same hour without explanation and leaving behind the same 2 words like a signature. And he could not find it. He could not find any gap or creak or smell, just a room, just a lamp on the nightstand and the green blanket and the mirror on the closet door, reflecting his own face back at him from across the room. And he looked at his own reflection for a moment and then looked past it into the dark of the closet behind the door. And then he stepped forward and pushed the closet door firmly shut and heard a latch click and stood back and watched it, and it did not move. And he said aloud to the empty room that it was a loose latch, just a loose latch, And his voice came back to him flat and unconvincing in a particular way that voices sound in rooms that are not inclined to agree with you. He went back to the kitchen. Lena was already there, sitting at the table with her laptop open, and he could see from the doorway that she was looking at the listing at the reviews, reading the 3 identical 2-word warnings in sequence. And he sat down across from her, and she looked up and said, "I want to know what happened in there before we moved in." And he said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "A house has history. Every house has history, and I want to know what this room's history is." And Declan looked at her and thought about saying that it didn't matter, that whatever had happened in a room decades ago had nothing to do with a loose latch and some guests who were bad sleepers. And then he thought about Ivy's voice on the phone, that flat pressed-down quality. And he thought about the note card moved to the center of the bed, and the blanket folded with that strained precision, and the timestamp appearing 3 times like something being counted. And he said, "Okay," and Lena nodded and turned back to her laptop, and began to look, and Declan sat across from her and listened to the house around them, steady and quiet and full of something neither of them had a name for yet. The water heater made its sound again from the basement, that low animal groan that had become the background note of the last several weeks. And Declan got up and poured himself a glass of water and stood at the sink looking out at the backyard in the dark, and thought about the fact that they had moved into this house 2 years ago because it was affordable and in a good neighborhood and had a spare room they thought might be useful someday. And now that spare room had become the center of something he could feel the edges of but not the shape of, something that 3 strangers had encountered and run from and refused to describe. And he thought about Ivy saying, "I can't talk about that place," and thought about the particular way she had said it. Not "I won't," but "I can't," as though talking about it was not a matter of choice but capacity, as though the room had taken something from her that she could not yet afford to spend. Declan said it first, which surprised Lena, because she had expected to be the one to suggest it and had been working out how to say it in a way that would not start a fight. But he came downstairs on Sunday morning and sat across from her at the kitchen table and said he was going to sleep in the guest room that night. And she looked up from her coffee and waited, and he said he needed to know. That was all. He just needed to know for himself, because they could not keep going the way they were. Going, circling the room and flinching at latches and reading meaning into checkout times. And if he spent a night in there and nothing happened, then they would have something solid to stand on, some actual first-hand experience to put against the reviews and the timestamps and Ivy's voice on the phone. And Lena looked at him for a long moment and said, "What if something does happen?" And Declan said, "Then we'll know that too." And Lena looked down at her coffee and said, "Okay," and the word came out, quieter than she intended. He spent the day doing ordinary things with a deliberate kind of focus, fixing the loose handle on the back door, catching up on work emails, eating lunch at the counter while reading something on his phone, not avoiding the subject exactly but not returning to it either. And Lena moved around him in the same way, the 2 of them occupying a house like people who have agreed to a truce without spelling out the terms. And in the afternoon, Lena went into the guest room and checked that everything was in order and closed the closet door and came back out and told Declan it was ready. And he nodded and said thank you. And she went and sat in the living room and picked up her book and did not read a single word of it. After dinner, Declan took a shower and changed into clothes. He slept in and stood in the kitchen doorway and said goodnight. And Lena said goodnight. And he walked down the hall and went into the guest room and pulled the door shut behind him. And Lena sat in the living room and listened to the house. She could hear him moving around in there at first, the small sounds of a person settling in, the creak of the bed, the click of the lamp being switched on, the muffled sound of his phone. And then those sounds faded, and the house went quiet, and she sat with her book open in her lap, and the words running together on the page and the clock on the wall moving with a slowness that felt deliberate. She went to bed at 11 and lay in the dark and listened and heard nothing, and told herself that was good, that the absence of sound was exactly what she wanted to hear. And she lay there listening to the nothing for a long time before she finally slept. Declan had laughed a little when he first got into the bed, Not a real laugh, but the small involuntary sound a person makes when they catch themselves being afraid of something they cannot point to, because the room was just a room. That was the thing. It was just a room they had painted and furnished and made up with clean sheets and a good lamp and a green blanket. And he lay back on the pillow and looked at the ceiling. It was just a ceiling, and the closet door was closed the way Lena had closed it, and the mirror on the back had caught the faint light from the window and threw a pale rectangle across the floor, and the lamp on the nightstand put a warm circle on the wall, and none of it was frightening. None of it was anything at all, and he thought about the guests and their identical reviews and their identical checkout times, and decided that there was a reasonable explanation for all of it that he simply had not found yet, and with that thought settled in his chest, like ballast, he closed his eyes and went to sleep faster than he had in weeks. He woke at some point in the deep part of the night, and did not know why. There was no sound. Nothing had touched him. No dream had pushed him up from sleep. He was simply awake in a way you sometimes are in unfamiliar places, the body registering the wrongness of the ceiling before the mind catches up. And he lay still and looked at the ceiling and waited for the feeling to pass the way it usually did. It did not pass. The room was cold, not the ambient nighttime cold of a house in autumn, but something more specific, a cold with location, a cold that seemed to be coming from the direction of the closet. And he turned his head and looked at the closet door and the mirror on it, and the pale rectangle of reflected light on the floor. And everything was exactly as it had been when he fell asleep, except that the cold was there now, and the air in the room had a quality he could not describe, a thickness, a pressure, the way air feels in the moment before a storm, when the atmosphere is doing something you can feel, but not yet see. He sat up slowly and put his feet on the floor, and the cold was worse near the floor, and he sat there on the edge of the bed and looked at the closet door and the dark gap at the bottom of it, and told himself that the window probably had a draft, and the cold air was pooling at floor level the way cold air did, and then the quality of the dark in the room changed in a way that had nothing to do with light, nothing added or removed, just a shift in the texture of the dark itself. The way a shadow changes when something moves through it from a direction you are not looking. And Declan sat on the edge of the bed in the cold and did not move for a very long time. He could not have said how long he sat there. The feeling did not escalate, did not announce itself, did not take a shape he could describe or a direction he could point to. It simply sat in the room with him like a pressure behind the eyes, like the sensation being watched from very close by something that was not moving. And he sat with it and breathed and told himself there was nothing there, and could feel with some part of himself that was below the level of reason, that telling himself there was nothing there was not the same as. There being nothing there. At some point the feeling began to recede. Gradually, the way fog lifts and the cold pulled back and the air thinned to something normal. And Declan sat on the edge of bed in an ordinary room with an ordinary lamp and an ordinary closet door, and felt the sweat that had gathered at the back of his neck go cool in the open air. He got up. He went to the door. He went out into the hallway and pulled the guest room door shut behind him and stood in the dark hall for a moment, and then went upstairs and got into his own bed next to Lena and lay on his back and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep again. Lena woke at 7 and turned and looked at him and said, "You're back." And he said yes, and she said, "How was it?" And he looked at the ceiling for a moment and then said, "Fine." And she looked at him the way she looked at him when fine meant something else entirely, and said, "Declan." And he said, "I don't want to talk about it right now." And she said, "Okay." And they lay there in the morning quiet and did not talk about it. She went down to make coffee, and he heard her footsteps in the hallway, and then a pause, and then her footsteps again, slower this time. And then she appeared in the bedroom doorway with her phone in her hand, and her face arranged in the careful way she arranged it when she was keeping something level that wanted to tip. And she held the phone out to him, and he took it and looked at the photo she had taken in the hallway outside the guest room, of the floor just in front of the door, where his pillow was sitting on the floorboards with its open end facing the wall, placed there neatly and deliberately in the night by something that had not been him. Declan sat up in bed and looked at the photo for a long time, and then handed the phone back without a word. Lena came and sat on the edge of the bed and set the phone face down on the nightstand, and they sat together in the early morning light coming to the curtains, and she did not ask him what had happened in the room, because she could see on his face that he had decided not to tell her. Not yet. And she respected the decision, even though it made the space between them feel wider than the width of the bed. He got up after a while and went down and poured coffee and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the backyard. And she came down and stood beside him, and eventually he said, "I felt something in there." And she said, "I know." And he said, "I can't explain it." And she said, "I know." And he said, "It wasn't anything I could see." And she said, "I know." "Declan." And he turned and looked at her and said, "How do you know?" And she said, "Because 3 other people felt it too, and none of them could explain it either. And that is why they all left at the same time. And that is why they all used the same words." He turned back to window. The backyard looked the way it always looked. The old fence and the overgrown corner near the shed and the tree that dropped leaves into the gutters every fall. All of it ordinary and unchanged. And he stood looking at it and thought about the cold and the pressure and the shift in the dark and tried to find language for it and could not. Because the thing about whatever was in that room was that it did not give you language. It gave you a feeling. And then it took the feeling away and left you, standing in the ordinary morning light, unable to prove to anyone, including yourself, that the feeling had been real. He said he was going to take a shower, and Lena said okay, and he went upstairs, and she stood at the kitchen window in his place, and looked out at the ordinary backyard, and listened to the house, and thought about the pillow on the floor facing the wall, and what kind of thing moved a pillow in the night, and why it would, what the purpose of it could possibly be. And she thought about the note card moved to the center of the bed, and the blanket folded with its strange precision, and the closet door that no latch could explain anymore. And she thought about the history of the house, which she had only begun to look into the night before, and had not yet found anything useful. And she thought about the room at the end of the hall, and what it had been before they moved in, and what might have happened inside it, and whether whatever had happened was still happening in some way that she did not yet have the vocabulary to describe. And outside the water heater groaned from the basement, and the leaves moved in the tree at the back of the yard, and the house held its breath around it the way it always did, patient and quiet and entirely disinclined to answer. Lena started with the county records, because that was where you started when you wanted to know the history of a house, and did not know where else to begin. And the county records were public and searchable, and gave her the ownership history going back to the original construction date, which was 1941. And she wrote down the names in order on a notepad at the kitchen table while Declan was at work. A succession of families and individual owners across 8 decades, some of them staying for 20 years or more, others lasting only a season. And she looked at the gaps between the sales and tried to read meaning into the length of tenure, the way you read meaning into pauses in conversation, looking for the ones that were too short, the ones that suggested departure rather than intention. The house had changed hands in 1967 after only 14 months of ownership, and again in 1979 after less than a year, and those 2 short stays snagged her attention, and she wrote the names down separately and went looking for more. The 1967 owners were a couple named the Aldermans, and she found a brief mention of them in a digitized local newspaper archive, a small notice in the spring of that year that mentioned the sudden sale of their property on her street and their relocation out of state. The language of the notice bland and administrative, giving nothing away, but the word sudden was there, and she underlined it. The 1979 owner was a man named Fenwick, who had lived alone in the house for 9 months and then sold it at a loss, which the record showed plainly in the difference between the purchase price and the sale price. And selling a house at a loss after 9 months meant something. Meant that leaving had been more important than recouping what you had put in. And Lena sat with that for a while before continuing. She found what she was actually looking for in a different archive, a collection of digitized documents from the local historical society that included, among other things, a set of records from a visiting nurse service that had operated in the county in the 1950s. And in those records, filed under the address of her house, was a series of case notes spanning 14 months between 1953 and 1954, written in the clipped, careful language of medical professional recording observations without editorializing. and the notes described a patient who had been confined to a back bedroom of the house during prolonged illness, isolated from the rest of the household on the advice of a physician, whose name appeared only as an initial, kept in a room for reasons and notes described as precautionary, but never specified beyond that word. And the notes recorded the patient's deterioration across those 14 months in language that grew progressively shorter and more restrained as the months passed, as though the nurse writing them had made a decision at some point to record less, to put down only the minimum, and the final entry was 3 lines, a date in November 1954, the words patient unresponsive, family not present, and then a single word at the end that Lena read twice before she understood it. The word alone, written at the end of the last line with no further notation, no follow-up entry, nothing after it but the end of file. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time after she read that. The room at the end of the hall had been a sick room. Someone had been kept in it, isolated, for over a year and had died in it, and had died alone in it. And the word the nurse had chosen to record that fact was alone, not unattended or without family present but alone, as though the aloneness were the important thing. The thing worth noting, the thing that mattered most about how it ended. She got up and went to the hallway and stood outside the door to the guest room and looked at it and thought about 14 months in a single room with the door closed and the family on the other side of it, and whatever view there was of the backyard to the window. And she thought about what a person becomes after 14 months of that, and whether becoming was even the right word, whether what she meant was what a person leaves behind, what accumulates in the walls and the floorboards, and the air of a room where someone spent that long being alone and afraid, and then stopped. And she put her hand on the door and did not open it, and stood there in the hallway until she heard the front door and Declan's keys on the hook. She did not tell him everything that night. She told him about the county records and the short-stay owners and the nurse's case notes in the sick room, and said someone died in that room, Declan. And he sat across from her at the kitchen table and listened, and his face went through several things and settled on something careful and controlled. And he said when, and she said 1954, and he said that was 70 years ago, and she said I know, and he said houses are old, Lena, people die in houses, and she said not like this, and he said what does that mean? And she said alone, and the word sat between them on the table the same way it had sat at the end of that final case note, with all its weight. He went quiet after that. Over the days that followed, something shifted in Declan in a way that Lena could not quite name but could feel, a withdrawal, a reduction, as though he were taking up slightly less space in the house than he usually did. And she noticed that he had stopped going into the kitchen after dark to get water the way he always had, and that he had started leaving the television on when he went to bed, and that he had moved his pillow from his side of the bed to the center, which was something he had never done before. And she thought about his pillow on the floor of the hallway facing the wall, and did not say anything. Strange things began happening during the day. Not dramatic things. Not things that announced themselves. Just small, persistent wrongnesses that accumulated the way water stains accumulate, gradually, and then all at once. A coffee mug she had left on the kitchen counter appeared on the floor of the hallway near the guest room door, upright, unbroken, set there with the same deliberate neatness as the folded blanket and the center note card and the pillow facing the wall. A smell began moving to the house in the afternoons, faint and hard to locate, not unpleasant exactly, but wrong. The kind of smell that makes you check things, check the stove and the trash and the drain, and finding nothing, you stand in the hallway and realize the smell is stronger there, near the guest room door, and then you go back an hour later and it is gone. Declan noticed the smell before she told him about the mug, and he said nothing about it, and she said nothing about it, and they ate dinner and watched television, and the house was quiet, and she could feel him not sleeping beside her in the dark, lying very still way people lie still when they are listening, and she lay still beside him and listened too. She found the photograph on a Thursday afternoon when she went into the guest room to open a window and let some air in, and she found it not on any surface, but tucked behind a radiator beneath the window. slipped down into the narrow gap between the radiator and the baseboard, as though it had been put there on purpose or had worked its way back there over a very long time. And she pulled it free, and it was a photograph printed on the kind of thick paper stock that photographs were printed on decades ago, black and white, showing the room she was standing in, the same room, the same window and the same dimensions and the same basic bones of space, but empty of everything they had put into it. The bed a different bed, the walls bare, the floor without the small rug she had bought, and the far corner of the room, the corner that was farthest from the window and caught the least light, there was a shape, upright, roughly the height of a person, not distinct enough to be called a figure, but too present to be called a shadow, standing in the corner of the room in a photograph taken before she and Declan had ever lived here, before the lamp and the green blanket and the mirror on the closet door. And Lena stood in the room holding the photograph and looked from the image to the corner, and the corner was dim the way it always was, and empty the way it always appeared, and she looked at the photograph again, and the shape was still there, and she looked at the corner again, and the air in it had a quality she recognized now, a density, and she did not look at it for long. She brought the photograph downstairs and set it on the kitchen table and sat across from it and looked at it. She thought about the nurse's final case note and the word alone, and the 14 months and the family on the other side of the door, and she thought about what it meant to die in a room and whether the dying stayed, whether it pooled in the corners the way cold air pooled at floor level, whether it accumulated in the walls the way moisture accumulated, invisible and patient and gradually corrosive. And she thought about Ivy and Morris and Audra lying in the bed in that room in the dark end, feeling something they had no words for, and leaving at 3:17 in the morning without explanation, because explanation required language, and whatever was in that room had not given them language. It had given them a feeling, the same feeling it had given Declan, and the feeling had been enough. She thought about Declan sleeping in that room, and the pillow on the floor in the morning, and the thing he still had not told her about what had happened in the hours between midnight and dawn, the thing that had made his face do what it did when she said, "I felt something in there," the flicker of recognition, and the quick, deliberate blankness that came after it. And she understood that he was protecting her from something, but could not tell yet whether what he was protecting her from was the story or from his own fear of it. And she thought those might not be different things. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in pencil, faded to near legibility, was a date, November 1954, the month and year of the last case note, the month and year of the word alone. She set the photograph back down on the table and looked at the ceiling, and then at the hallway, and then at the closed door at the end of it, and she thought about going in and looking at the corner, really looking at it this time, standing in front of it in the daylight, and looking directly at it instead of glancing and looking away. And she sat with the intention for a long moment, and then she got up and went and stood in the hallway and put her hand on the door and stopped. She could feel the cold through the door. Lena did not tell Declan about the cold through the door. She told him about the photograph, showed it to him at the kitchen table that evening after dinner, set it down in front of him and watched him look at it. And he looked at it for a long time without speaking, turning it over to read the date on the back, and then turning it face up again and looking at the corner of the room in the image, the shape that was not quite a shape, the darkness that had a density the surrounding darkness did not. And then he set it down and pushed it slightly away from him and said, "Where did you find this?" And she told him, and he nodded and said nothing else, and she waited, and he said nothing else. She did not tell him about the cold, because she was not sure yet what to do with it, and she did not want to do the thing they had been doing, which was taking each new piece of information and setting it on the table between them and looking at it together, and then not knowing what to do next, accumulating evidence without any means of acting on it. And she had started to feel that what they needed was not more evidence, but a different kind of engagement with what was already there, which was why she had started setting her alarm for 3 in the morning. She had not told Declan about the alarm either. She set it for the first time on a Wednesday night, low enough that it would not wake him. And when it went off, she silenced it before it had finished its first pulse and lay still for a moment listening to him breathe, and then slipped out of bed and went the hallway and sat down on the floor outside the guest room door with her back against the wall and her knees drawn up and waited. Nothing happened that first night. The hallway was cold and the floor was hard, and she sat there until 4, and the guest room door did not move, and the house made only its ordinary noises, and she went back to bed stiff and cold and slept badly until morning. The second night was the same. She almost had not set the alarm for the third night, but something in her was committed to it now. Some part of her that had looked at those 3 timestamps in the photograph and the nurse's final case note and arrived at the conclusion that if there was a pattern, then the pattern could be witnessed, and witnessing it felt like the only form of agency she had left. The third night was a Thursday, and she slipped out of bed at 2:50 and went a hallway and sat against the wall across from the guest room door and looked at it and waited, and the house was quiet. At 3:10 the temperature in the hallway dropped, not gradually but quickly, the way a door opening onto winter drops the temperature of a room, sudden and total, and Lena pulled her knees closer and watched the guest room door, and her breath was visible in the air in front of her face, small clouds appearing and dissolving, and the cold deepened, and the hallway felt smaller somehow, closer, as though the walls had moved incrementally inward in the dark, and she kept her eyes on the door. At 3:17, exactly, the door opened. Not quickly, not violently, not with a sound, just slowly and completely, swinging inward on its hinges with a smoothness that suggested intention rather than draft, opening to its full width and stopping, and the room beyond it was dark, the lamp off, the window admitting only the faint gray of the streetlight filtered through the curtain, and Lena sat on the floor of the hallway and looked into the room, and the room looked back. She could see the bed and the nightstand and the pale rectangle of the mirror on the closet door and the far corner. And the far corner had that quality she had seen in the photograph, that density, that darkness within darkness. And she looked at it, and it did not move, and she did not move, and the cold was very bad now, deep in her hands and her feet and the back of her neck. And she thought about staying where she was, and she thought about Ivy and Morris and Audra and the word alone at the end of the final case note. And she stood up. Her legs were stiff on the floor, and she stood in the hallway in the open doorway and looked into the room, and then she stepped inside. The door closed behind her. Not slammed, not pushed, just closed, the latch clicking softly into place with the same smoothness as when it had opened. And Lena stood in the dark room and breathed, and did not turn around to try to handle, because she understood somehow that trying to handle was not what this was about, that the door closing was not a trap, but an indication, the room making clear that what happened next happened in here, in the dark, between her and whatever had been in this room for 70 years. The cold was everywhere now, uniform and total, and the dark was a kind of dark that is texture, that you can feel against your skin like something with weight. And she stood in it and waited, and the corner was very dark, and she looked at it, and the looking had a quality that was different from any other looking she had ever done, because it looked back, not with eyes, not with anything she could point to or describe, but with a presence that was complete and close and very, very old. And she understood in that moment, standing in a cold, dark room at 3:17 in the morning, that the thing in the corner was not malicious and was not benign, that those were human categories, and this was not a human thing, that it was simply there, had been there since November of 1954, since the last entry in a case file, and the word alone written at the end of it, and that it had no intention of leaving because it had nowhere else to go and no understanding of anywhere else, and that it had been here through 8 decades of owners and families and short stays and sudden sales at a loss, patient and present and entirely indifferent to weather. Anyone believed in it, waiting with the particular patience of something that has already lost the thing it was waiting for and has simply forgotten how to stop. She did not know how long she stood there. The communication, if that was a word for it, had no language, was not language, was more like the understanding that comes in dreams where meaning arrives whole and without translation. And what arrived in her was not a message, but condition, the condition of that room over 70 years, the accumulated weight of presence without witness. And she felt it the way you feel cold water, completely and all at once. And it was grief. That was the only word she had for it afterward. It was grief. On a scale that had no human proportion. Grief that had outlasted the body that produced it and gone on accumulating the walls of a room with no one to receive it. And she stood in it until the door opened again, slowly and quietly the way it had closed, and the cold began to pull back and the dark thinned, and she walked out into the hallway and stood there and shook, not from cold, but from the effort of having held all of that inside a body that was not built to hold it. She went downstairs. She did not know why she went downstairs instead of back to bed, but she went to the kitchen and sat at the table and put her hands flat on the surface and breathed until the shaking stopped. And the kitchen was warm and lit by the small light above the stove, and it was the most ordinary room she had ever been in, and she was grateful for every ordinary thing in it. She heard Declan on the stairs, and then he was in the doorway in the kitchen light looking at her with his face open and afraid, and he said her name, and she turned and looked at him, and she could feel that her face was doing something she could not control, and he crossed the room and sat beside her, and said what happened, and she looked at him for a moment, and said it wants us to stop renting the room. And he said, what? And she said, it was here first. Declan, it has always been here. And he said, Lena, and she looked at him and said, it already knows we won't stop. And neither of them said anything after that for a long time. And the kitchen light was warm and steady above them, and down the hall the guest room door was closed, and behind at the corner was dark, and the house was quiet in the way it was always quiet, patient and complete. And Lena kept her hands flat on the table and breathed and thought about the word alone, and thought that she understood it now in a way the nurse, who wrote it, could not have intended. And that understanding sat in her chest like cold water that had nowhere left to go. Declan sat beside her and did not move for a long time, and she could feel him working through it the way he worked through things, methodically and in silence, not dismissing what she had said, but carrying it from one part of his mind to another, looking for the shelf it belonged on. And she knew there was no shelf for it, and that he would figure that out, and she waited. He said, what does it want? And she said, I told you. It wants us to stop renting the room. And he said, no. I mean, why does it want that? And she thought about standing in the cold and the dark with the grief coming off the corner like heat in reverse. And she said, I think it wants to be left alone. And the word alone sat in the kitchen between them the same way it had sat at the end of that case note, heavy and complete, and containing more than a single word should be able to contain. He said, we can stop renting it. And Lena looked at him, and something moved across her face. And he saw it and said, what? And she said, already knows we won't. And he said, how can it know that? And she said, the same way it knows everything else. The same way it knew when Ivy was in the bed, and when Morris was in the bed, and when Audra was in the bed, and when you were in the bed. It knows because the room is where it is, and the room is what it pays attention to. And whatever we decide at this table, at 4 a.m, it already knows. Because it has been in that room for 70 years watching people decide things and leave, and it already knows what we're going to do before we know it ourselves. Declan was quiet after that. She did not sleep again that night. And when the morning came gray and ordinary through the kitchen window, she was still at the table, her hand still flat on its surface, listening to the house breathe around her and thinking that she had never understood before how much could live a room and how long could go on living there and what it cost. The listing went live again on a Saturday morning, and neither Declan nor Lena had made it active. Declan found it first, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee the way he always did on Saturday mornings, scrolling through his phone with the particular aimless attention of someone who is not looking for anything specific. And then he was looking at something specific. He was looking at their listing on the platform, active and visible and accepting bookings, with the photographs they had taken on that hopeful Saturday weeks ago, and the description he had written and the price they had agreed on, and the availability, showing the room open for coming week. And he sat very still and read it twice, and then went to settings and tried to deactivate it, and the page refreshed and the listing was still active, and he tried again and the page loaded slowly and then showed him the listing active, as though he had not just attempted to close it. He called Lena down and showed her, and she stood behind him and read the screen over his shoulder and said, "Did you do this?" And he said, "No," and she said, "Are you sure?" And he looked at her and she said, "Okay," and took the phone and tried herself, and the listing remained active, and she handed the phone back. And they looked at each other across the kitchen, and outside the morning was gray and still, and the house was quiet. Declan called the platform support line and was on hold for 20 minutes, and then spoke to someone who checked the account and said they could not see any issue on their end. The listing appeared to be functioning normally, and Declan said, "I need it deactivated," and the person said, "Certainly, I can do that for you." And Declan heard typing, and then a pause, and then more typing, and then the person said, "That's strange," and Declan said, "What?" And the person said, "It's showing as active on my end. Let me try that again." And there was more typing, and another pause, and then the person said, "I'm going to escalate this to our technical team, and we'll have it resolved within 24 hours. And Declan said, "I need it down now," and the person apologized and said they would do their best and gave him a case number, and the line went quiet. The booking came in at 11:47 that same morning. A single night, arriving at 6 in the evening. The profile attached to the request showing no photo, no verified information, no previous reviews, a username that was a string of letters and numbers with no logic to it. The kind of profile that the platform usually flagged and filtered, and yet the booking request was there, sitting in the app alongside the case number from the support call, and Declan stared at it and did not accept it, and the morning passed, and the afternoon came in at 4 o'clock. The booking showed as confirmed in the app, and neither of them had confirmed it. Lena stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the confirmation on Declan's phone and said, "We should leave," and Declan said, "Where would we go?" And she said, "Anywhere." And he looked at her, and she looked back, and they both knew they were not going to leave. Not because they were brave, but because whatever was going to happen regardless. And leaving felt like a different kind of surrender than staying. And also because the water heater needed replacing, and the car payment was due. And the credit card statement was still sitting on the counter where Lena had set it 2 days ago, and the number at the bottom had not changed. The guest arrived at 6 exactly. They heard the car before they saw it, a dark sedan pulling slowly to the curb in front of the house, and then the door opening, and then a figure coming up the front walk. And Declan went to the door and opened it before the knock came, because waiting for the knock felt worse than not waiting. And the guest was standing on the porch, and Declan looked at them, and later he would not be able to describe them with any consistency, would find when he tried to recall the face that the details rearranged themselves, the height seeming different each time he thought about it, the clothing indistinct, the overall impression of a person present and complete, but somehow resistant to being fixed in memory. The way a face seen in peripheral vision is never quite the same when you turn to look at it directly. The guest said the name on the booking, just a username, as though it were a normal name, and Declan said, "Yes, come in," and stepped back. And the guest came inside and looked down the hallway toward the guest room door, and did not look at anything else in the house, not the living room to the left or the kitchen straight ahead, or Lena standing in the kitchen doorway. Just a door at the end of the hall, and then looked back at Declan and said, "Thank you," and Declan led them down the hall and opened the guest room door, and the guest stepped inside, and the room received them in the way a room receives someone has been expecting. And the guest turned once slowly and looked at each wall, and then at the closet door, and then at the corner, the far corner, the one that was always dark, and stood looking at it for a moment with an expression that Declan could not see from the doorway, but that made the back of his neck go cold. And then the guest said, "This is fine," and Declan said goodnight, and pulled the door shut, and stood in the hallway and listened and heard nothing, and went back to the kitchen where Lena was standing, with her arms crossed and her face arranged in the careful way it arranged itself when she was keeping something level. They did not watch television that night. They sat at the kitchen table and talked in low voices about things that had nothing to do with the room, the grocery list and the water heater, and a film they had both been meaning to watch, talking the way people talk when they are filling silence on purpose. And the house was quiet around them, and the guest room door at the end of the hall stayed closed, and no sound came from behind it, and the clock moved toward midnight, and then past it, and Lena said she was in bed, and Declan said he would be up soon, and she went upstairs, and he sat alone at the kitchen table in the small light above the stove and listened to the house and thought about the guest standing in the room, looking at the corner with that expression he had not been able to see, and thought about the corner looking back. He went to bed at 1. He lay in the dark beside Lena and listened, and the house gave him nothing. No sound, no cold, no pressure, just the ordinary nighttime quiet. And he lay in it and waited, and at some point without meaning he slept. Neither of them set an alarm. They woke at 7 and lay still for a moment in the morning light, and then Declan got up and went to the hallway and looked at the guest room door, and it was open, standing fully open the way it always was in the morning, and the room beyond was empty, the bed made with that precise, deliberate neatness, the green blanket folded at the foot with its careful geometry, the lamp off, the closet door closed for the first time in as long as either of them could remember. He stood in the doorway and looked at the room, and the room was still and quiet, and the corner was just a corner, dim in the morning light the way corners were dim, without density, without weight, just a corner where two walls met in an ordinary room at the end of an ordinary hall. Lena appeared beside him, and they stood together in the doorway and looked in, and neither of them said anything for a long time. Then Declan picked up his phone and opened the platform, and the notification was there. A new review posted at 3:17 in the morning, 5 stars, and he read it and then held the screen out to Lena without a word, and she read it and looked up at him and then looked back at the room and then at the phone again. The review was 4 words. Exactly what I was looking for. He scrolled to the reviewer's profile to see if anything had changed, and the profile photo had updated, no longer blank, now showing image, and the image was a photograph of the guest room taken from inside the closet. The door opened just enough to frame the room beyond it, the bed, and the nightstand, and the lamp, and the green blanket, and the far corner. And in the far corner there was nothing, just the wall, just the ordinary pale wall in the gray morning light, empty and still, and Declan stood in the hallway outside the open door of the room they had rented and held the phone and looked at the photograph of the empty corner and felt something he did not have a word for, something that was not relief and was not fear, but was in the space between them. The space that opens up when something that has been present for a very long time is suddenly and completely gone. Lena took the phone from him and looked at the photograph again for a long time, and then set the phone on a hallway table face down, and looked at the room, the real room, the one in front of them with the morning light, coming to the curtain, and the green blanket folded, and the closet door closed, and said, "Do you think it is gone?" And Declan said, "I don't know." And she said, "Do you feel like it is gone?" And he stood in the doorway and paid attention to the room the way he had learned to pay attention to rooms over the past several weeks, with his whole body rather than just his eyes. And the room was still, and the air was ordinary, and the corner was a corner. And he said, "Yes, I think so." And she nodded slowly, and he could not tell from her face whether that was what she had wanted to hear. She went into the kitchen, and he followed, and he filled the kettle, and she got down the cups, and the morning moved around them with its ordinary weight. And he thought about the platform notification still on his phone, and the case number from the support call, and the profile photo taken from inside the closet. And then he set the phone face down on the counter beside the kettle and left it there, and he thought about the guest standing in the room, looking at the corner, and thought about Ivy on the phone, saying she could not talk about that place, and thought about the 14 months in the nurse's case notes and the word alone at the end of them. And he thought that whatever had needed to happen in that room had finally happened, that something had arrived that the room had been waiting for, that the guest and the thing in the corner had found in each other whatever it was that ended the waiting. And he did not know if that was a comfort or not, but it was what he had, and he held it quietly while the kettle heated. Lena looked at the closed door one last time from the kitchen doorway and then turned away, and the house settled around them both into its ordinary morning quiet, holding everything it had ever held, patient and unchanged and entirely its own.